Good morning, afternoon, and evening, people of the internet. This is Stonefruit with another stirring edition of the Hardline According to Stonefruit. Back in action again with my main man, Mark French.
Hey, good day, everybody.
An intellectual polymath, a analyzer of trends, geopolitical and economic, and a perfect partner in goodness to help me and us discuss de-dollarization, which, as usual, is accompanied by an article at stonefruit.substack.com. And to set it off, I would begin by saying that there are three primary sources that provide the impetus for this widespread and intensifying international de-dollarization. And it's kind of like when you learn a new word, you start seeing it everywhere. You know, now that I wrote this article on de-dollarization, I'm hearing it on all the podcasts I listen to. And the three sources that I see are, number one, America's widespread use of sanctions. You might have caught the recent China Daily article on US hegemony and its perils. Maybe we can do a future podcast on that. But it called America the United States of sanctions and said that we're saying dozens of countries that compose half of the population of the globe.
That's right.
And part of these sanctions are freezing, basically stealing USD reserve accounts and USD denominated accounts. And of course, the colossal size of America's federal debt, which will never be repaid, and opacity relating to the monetary supply in the United States. And the symptoms that I see of this de-dollarization include a large progressive reduction in the size of China's holdings of treasury bills and significant new buying of gold as a reserve asset by central banks, and the rise of the petro yuan at the expense of the petrodollar, and the creation of alternatives to the Belgium-based Western-led SWIFT interbank communication platform, and a world on the cusp of the entrance of potentially many new trade and reserve currencies, and the proliferation of bilateral currency swap arrangements, and finally the creation of new sources of finance independent of what one of our favorite economists, Michael Hudson, called the IMF a basement at the bottom of the Pentagon.
Yeah. And he's being quite literal. That's what it is.
I wonder, it surprised me. But shortly after Russia initiated its special military operation in Ukraine, the United States, the UK, Canada, and Europe, they all kicked off SWIFT. But they left some carve-outs for energy payments. And on February 27th of last year, the European Union introduced a suite of sanctions against Russia, including freezing its gold and foreign reserves. And these geniuses thought that it would turn what they like to say, the ruble to rubble. And look at how that backfired on those brilliant prognosticators. But the next day, the US, Japan, and the UK, and this shocked me, Mark, even traditionally neutral Switzerland, all joined in on these sanctions. And the net result was that Russia lost $300 billion of its $640 billion in gold and foreign reserves, just stolen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in this, they joined a long line of countries that have America and its vassal states. And let's see if we can bring in our first element here of Russia's reserves, which they had That's pretty spread out across the world.
Sure.
We're
London,
hedging.
at the behest of the United States, did the same thing to Venezuela, I think to the tune of about 80 billion.
Yeah, and London was holding Venezuela's gold, and they took it.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
now that Guaido is gone, I wonder what they're going to steal. So here's the elephant. Let's try and find the chart. I wonder if they're giving if London's giving Venezuela gold back now that Guaido is out. I haven't heard that they're giving it back yet.
Yeah, I highly doubt that.
So I might have the element up on the screen at this point. And this is a share of Russian central bank foreign currency. And you can see that a large portion of it was in China, yuan.
Mhm.
Large portion was in France, undoubtedly euros. Japan had a lot of yen. Germany, US, Bank of International Settlements, and the International Monetary Fund in UK. So even before that special military operation, they had it spread out, but they still lost $300 billion. Although I've really taken a shine to the Duran podcast, and they have said that EU and the associated co-conspirators trying to freeze Russia's reserves could only find $30 billion.
Mm.
And that's interesting. Kudos to Russia if they were able to evade that hack on their financial.
Well, I mean, they're really just getting
Now
out
we
ahead
need
of
to
the
turn
curve, right? I mean, you have London, the United States, doing this repeatedly all over the world. And on top of that, you brought up a very good point about SWIFT. Even before weaponizing SWIFT in a meaningful way against larger countries, SWIFT was already becoming very expensive, slow, and outdated. So the timing was just such. There needed to be something coming out of the East to avoid these Western weaponized sanction regimes. So it's been under construction for 15 or 20 years already, I think. The timing matched up as such that weaponizing SWIFT didn't work out very well. It was pretty insignificant.
Yeah, it's not only that the West, quote unquote, is able to weaponize SWIFT. It's that SWIFT already was expensive and cumbersome and had a lot of friction.
Yeah.
And I've seen estimates of you lose about 7 or 8% of your forex going through SWIFT.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get to the China's Enbridge digital yuan facility, but I've heard that cuts cross-border transfers in half, costs in half.
Mm-hmm.
But let us turn attention now to the deficit. And the official figure that's bandied about, there's a debt clock, is $31 trillion. And there's links to all these at stonefruit.substack.com. But what is never included in this official figure are all the unfunded Medicare and Medicaid benefits and the unfunded Social Security benefits. The US government takes in Social Security taxes and gives Social Security system T-bills. So if you just do the simple math on that, then that brings you up to $126 trillion. Because the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security are by themselves $55 trillion. And this is a year or two old figure.
Mm-hmm.
So conservatively, the figure is closer to 126 trillion. And there's an economist at Boston University, I believe, who says it's closer to 222 trillion. And the 126 trillion, that figure bringing in the Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security unfunded liabilities, David Walker was sounding the horn about that in the aughts. He's the former Inspector General of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which is a respected, nonpartisan watchdog of U.S. government finances, and he was raising the alarm about that in the aughts, and it wasn't 126 trillion then, but it is now.
Sure.
And so I think that is a conservative figure, even if you don't want to go as high as the 222 trillion. But this is sitting on top of a gross world product of about $80 trillion. And the care package, okay, great. We all got a few trifling payments in the very low four figures at best, while they're shoveling out trillions to Blackstone and all the other big hedge funds and big banks.
Mm-hmm.
Just 4 or 5 trillion just given to them.
Well, and for the first time in history, put directly on their books.
Yeah. I mean, imagine how different the course of history would have been if they had given even a fraction of that just to the people.
Sure.
But they don't. The American government exists to serve the donor class and the 0.01%. And the 0.99% are the technocrats of that 0.01%. And that collective 1% is getting all of the benefits from the care, the stimulus packages. And the fact that the Treasury has to issue Treasury bills, and then the Federal Reserve gives them the fake money. This is a Ponzi scheme. How will it ever be repaid? It's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do the back of the envelope calculations on, okay, what's the median income of people? Last I checked, it was around 35 grand a year. About half the people of our population are working. So this was a few years ago for me, but my back of the envelope calculations were that for our share, quote unquote, of a debt that we never agreed to would be in excess of $300,000.
Yeah. Right.
So if we're earning 35 grand a year, that means 7 years of working without buying food,
sure,
or shelter or clothing to pay our share of the debt back. It's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And the money supply is very opaque as well. And in early 2021, the Federal discontinued updating the M1 and M2 weekly money supply series. And they quit updating the M3 well before that in March of 2006. And here's something that shocked me that got absolutely no notice and was just a few sentence long press release from the Fed on March 15th, 2020, that they eliminated all banking reserve requirements. So it's not even fractional banking anymore, which is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
So sanctions, federal debt, a murky American money supply have all severely undermined trust in the dollar. And we'll see if I can pull up another element to show how the dollar's share of international reserve currencies has been dropping over the years from about 60%, I believe. Let's have a look. This might require my glasses again. But yeah, I believe it started out around 70% several years ago. There it is, 66% in 2014. And you see it's just been a steady decline till about 59% right before the pandemic. And it rebounded a little with the pandemic because, in times of uncertainty,
that's just people running to what is optically safe, right? That's just people freaking out.
The devil you
and
know.
in the case of China specifically, why why are they going to stick all their money over here just for us to use it to ring them around with aircraft carriers and threaten them?
Yeah, China is if there's some defining characteristics of them is that they're shrewd, pragmatic, and deality. And
Yeah,
in 2009, then Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner was asked by a group of Chinese graduate students if China's massive T-bill holdings were safe. And he said they were, and they laughed him out of the room.
yeah,
And their overall foreign exchange reserves were 3.18 trillion in January of this year. And their holdings of US government debt have dropped. In June 2022 was the lowest, was 967 billion, the lowest amount it had ever been since May 2010, when it was 843 billion dollars. So I think they're dropping T-bills because they're lower yield and to make a political point, but they are trading their dollar exposure into agency bonds like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the like. And those rose last year by $50.9 billion. And some think that China might be using third-party custody countries like Belgium. And I would also throw in there Luxembourg and Cayman
sure,
Islands, who remain major buyers of American T-bills.
of
And
course,
who knows who they're buying it for.
right.
What really fascinates me, because I am a gold bug, is that let's consider all the effort that the neoliberals have been putting into disparaging gold as a quote unquote barbarous relic for as long as we've been alive, right? Oh God, I caught myself. I hate pundits that say right at the end of every sentence. But they've been Wall Street, because they only have financial instruments, have been pissing all over gold forever
Sure.
because it doesn't generate interest and it can't be packaged and sold by Wall Street to gullible retail consumers or even theoretically sophisticated institutional investors. But even the IMF issued a report this January with a very telling title: Gold as International Reserve, a barbarous relic no more? Question mark.
Hmm.
They use that very phrase.
Yeah,
So, in fact, and I skimmed through the report, and it explicitly stated that one of the primary motivations for countries to go on this gold buying spree were the English sanctions that America and its vassals have been levying against anyone that incurs their wrath.
hmm,
And they also mentioned what everyone knows and why you can't really sell it as a barbarous relic is its traditional role as a store of value,
sure.
of, especially in these times of geopolitical risk and economic uncertainty.
Well, and that's the point, right? You just said that the right way. No one knows what this is going to look like right now. So it really
Yeah,
is safety, consistency, go with something you know that's going to get you through while the details of these new things get worked out. But the reason is very clear. They know the United States' role as the global hegemonic currency is very quickly coming to a close.
I think it's abundantly clear to everyone except DC and New York elites.
Sure.
And certainly there is no time of greater geopolitical risk and economic uncertainty than when one imperial order is collapsing and a new multipolar order is emerging.
Hmm.
And I see it, you see it, the global south sees it, the Russia China dyad and the BRICS see it, but New York, Wall Street, London, City of London, they don't. They're too hidebound by the consensus reality that they've bought into it. They've become professionally myopic. And the World Gold Council issued a report on buying trends last year, and it said that central banks bought 1,136 tons of gold last year, which was the highest amount of buying since 1967. That is when the gold pool of the US-led Western Alliance at that time started crumbling. And when France said, screw this, we're not in the gold pool anymore, and de Gaulle kept sending the Concorde over to Fort Knox to come back with gold, and they sent French naval vessels to New York to come back with gold. And this was right before Nixon, because America was bleeding gold, he took a USD off the gold standard in 71. So I think this might be a leading indicator that we are in a moment that might be presaging a moment as equally epoch-making as 1971 was in so many ways, and especially the Bretton Woods system collapsing and US going off of the gold standard.
Yeah, well, and we don't have to look that far back. I mean, one of the most interesting and exciting things about your work is how you're so often willing to cross disciplines, and it helps make things make sense in context, because we don't have to go back very far at all to see the last time that this happened. The transition from the pound sterling to the dollar was not that long ago. I mean, the final nail in the coffin of Britain being an empire was them attempting to capture the Suez Canal from Egypt and failing, and that did them in. These things, to not be able to even put things in context of happened that only 30, 40, less than 100 years ago, at this point is just irresponsible.
Yeah, I agree. And let's use that exact transition from the British Empire to the American Empire as a reference point. The British Empire reached its greatest extent immediately after World War I, when it held, I believe, 20% of the global landmass, maybe even 25%. I'll say at least 20%. But that was the maximum extent that it reached. But in the aftermath of World War I, the United Kingdom was broke.
Yes.
And it was just it was allowed to continue to lead the economic system basically at the sufferance of the United States, which also had its depression to deal with. So you have that period from the end of World War I, when British Empire is theoretically at its largest geographic extent. That's 1916, 17, until the Suez Canal, which I believe was 1951, thereabouts. So that's a period kind of like an imperial twilight for the British Empire. And I would argue that the article that Seymour Hersh just published on Substack about America blowing up Nord Stream, which got zero attention in the American media, but got a lot of play worldwide. I think the Nord Stream sabotage by the United States will go down as America's Suez Canal incident. The incident that capstones the stupidity and myopia of American elites in exactly the way that the Suez Canal did for British elites. So they had a several decade long twilight, And I would argue that from when we went off the gold standard in 71, or when the United States became a net debtor nation in, I believe, 1983, that was kind of the end of the American century, the end of the Pax Americana. And from then to now has been the American imperial twilight. And it also coincided with a brief unipolar moment during the 90s part of this century. So American elites weren't able to see it as a twilight, but as kind of the Wolfowitz doctrine and all of the other bipartisan neocons still think that this unipolar moment is in force, and they can't see the writing on the wall. So central bank demand for gold hits an all-time high in 2022. It's the second year-on-year increase in demand. And the biggest buyer last year was Turkey.
Who's been dealing with their own currency and inflation. So that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, they're in a unique geostrategic position. They're a NATO member, but they're also probably at the first in line for the BRICS expansion. I believe the BRICS are meeting this May, and the names I hear bandied about the most as who will be enlarged are Algeria, a major natural gas exporter, Iran, which just ascended to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization last year, Turkey, and Argentina, and Saudi Arabia. And I think one or perhaps even all of those could join BRICS this year. And certainly if just one or a couple of them do this year, those I think are going to be first in line for the next expansion. And BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization members were also leading the buying spree. China, and it accelerated towards the end of last year. China bought 30 tons in November of 2022, 32 tons in December, and 15 more tons this January, bringing their reserves to a total of 2,025 tons. And Russia no longer issues monthly data on how much they're purchasing, but they are believed to be active. The third was India, notable BRICS member and Shanghai Cooperation Organization member, and a country that is always trying to play both sides off the middle and always is kind of a geopolitical, geo-economic pivot point. And I think their participation in America's, one of their latest Indo-Pacific security gambits, the Quad, which is Japan, India, Australia, and America, I believe. I think India just said, yeah, okay, sure. But they're always looking out for
They
their
always
own.
play both sides. Absolutely.
They play both sides, and by playing both sides, look after their own national interests. And I don't expect that to ever change.
No.
But it is notable that the other big, albeit much smaller buyers were Shanghai Cooperation Organization members, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, who each bought 6 and 4 tons, respectively. So
and more oil regimes, right? That don't want to be sanctioned by the United States.
Yeah, well, we could talk about oil. We're going to dip into the petro yuan a bit later, but when China set up gold futures or gold-backed oil futures contracts to buy oil, one of the first nations to sign up was Nigeria in 1918, a major oil producer, and if I'm not mistaken, an OPEC member. And Ghana is selling gold to China for the petro yuan bonds on the Shanghai exchange. So even though the yuan is only 3 or 4% of global reserves and trade, it's coming up fast, and that might be Well, let's wrap up gold with noting that even our ally, well, former ally, I think America blowing up Nord Stream is probably going to cause Germany to withdraw from NATO, which is going to probably destroy NATO. But they, in the early part of last decade, they started raising the alarms that they wanted their gold back physically from New York and Paris.
Mhm.
And in 2017, they finished repatriating 743 tons of gold. So even America's closest, soon to be erstwhile allies were nervous enough to wonder if their gold had been apothecated and sold on contract and optioned out beyond existence. So they wanted their reserves back physically, and they repatriated them by the year 2017.
Sure.
But I think the most ominous thing for de-dollarization is the rise of the petro yuan. So a brief little background on the petro yuan. In 1974, 3 years after Nixon closed the gold window, our favorite unindicted war criminal, Henry Kissinger,
Yeah.
went to Saudi Arabia and said, "Here's the deal, kingdom. We'll give you military protection in exchange for you pricing oil in dollars." And they did. And since then, 80% of the world's oil sales have been in dollars. And America has kicked off a lot of pointless wars in this century, as is its wont. And I think every lover of peace is glad that they finally evacuated from Afghanistan. And the Washington Post, in a rare moment of practicing journalism, issued the Pentagon Papers in 2019 through a bunch of Freedom of Information Act requests that said that their American political and military leaders had, from the top down, had no idea of what their strategic purpose being there was, or any exit strategy, or any sense of plausible, useful, quote unquote, bombing targets. It was just a debacle. And the Afghan papers laid that all out from their own emails and documents. And that didn't make any splash at all in 2019 among the American elite. So finally, as soon as Biden gets into office, he pulls out of Afghanistan. I very much wonder how much Blackwater, Shea XE, Blackwater turned into XE. I will never know how to pronounce that. I wonder how many mercenaries are still there. And I know that CIA and other covert operations are still there for surveillance and drone targeting. But it's universally agreed upon that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was an absolute debacle. We're glad we did it, but it was a debacle. And while the American media elite were going tut-tut at what a debacle it was, Saudi Arabia and Russia signed a military cooperation agreement.
Yeah.
Didn't hear a peep out of that.
Sure.
Peep of the American media out of that when that happened. And then in 2018, a few years before that, China introduced its yuan denominated oil contracts for overseas crude.
Mhm.
Nigeria was an early adopter. And, you know, China buys 25% of Saudi Arabia's oil exports.
Sure.
And just this January at Davos, where the elite meet to rule the world,
Yeah.
the Saudi finance minister, Mohammed al-Jadaan, expressed the openness of the kingdom to selling its exports in yuan.
Hmm.
So you have a military agreement with Russia in 2021. You have, at the beginning of this year, a receptivity to selling its oil in other currencies. And I think this is a 30,000 foot elevation overview of de-dollarization, but that is one of the most striking features of de-dollarization is here and is in process. And we could also look at the new payment systems and interbank communication systems that bypass SWIFT. I talked about this on friend of this podcast and friend of ours, Dark and Ainsley Sevier, post-orthodoxy, that after Russia conducted their special military operation in Ukraine, they got kicked off. A bunch of US corporations boycotted Russia and withdrew. That included Visa and MasterCard. Well, no skin off of Russia's nose. They just linked their mere payment card to China's UnionPay payment card. And that immediately de-dollarized Russian trade. Let's see if we can pull up another element, because the de-dollarization happened suddenly.
Well, and I mean that's such a valid point that you bring up continuously throughout this piece. Is the more the United States, in a heavy-handed manner, leans into sanctions, it's going to create a feedback loop that de-dollarizes even faster.
Yeah. And the elites can't see it. It blows my mind. So let me center this a little bit better. This is the de-dollarization of trade. You can see that the yuan played a pretty small role until January 2022. And then look at how it just absolutely exploded as a bilateral trade settlement. From virtually nothing to extremely substantial. And there's no skin off the nose of Russia or China. It was just a proliferation of the cooperation that they had already created between the interbank payment system and Russia's interbank settlement system.
Well, and this is going to continue to happen over the next few decades, right? I mean, wow, what a shocking surprise. If you build that works better and it's useful, amazing. People will use it.
Yes. Russia's system is called the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, and they linked with China's cross-border interbank payment system. That goes back years, even before the sanctions, but that was because of the smart strategy of China and Russia, but I think led by China, which is, I think, the older brother in this new dyad of Russia-China leading the new multipolar world. That China knew that SWIFT eventually would be weaponized, or had been weaponized.
Had been since like the late 90s or something, sure.
Yeah. So they were creating the alternatives to SWIFT already. So when it was weaponized after Russia invaded, they were ready. And Russia has also integrated with Iran's CPAM, National Financial Messaging System. So I think China is linked with, if I'm not mistaken, over 100 countries with its cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS. And Iran and Russia have just united, and Russia is offering the same unification with India as well. So you have these major BRICS countries and Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries that are creating alternatives to SWIFT right now, using them.
Sure.
and not just alternatives to SWIFT, but new currencies. And in the case of Enbridge, a new currency that is also a cross-border payment settlement rail. So I think the most important trial currency, which is also a settlement rail alternative to SWIFT, is the Chinese central bank digital currency, the digital yuan. And they have constructed an Enbridge facility now, and they're using it for Belt and Road Initiative financing. And this is all on the blockchain, so there's no need. There's that minimizes counterparty risk because they all see it. It's an unfungible ledger. And this was initially a trial run between the Bank of International Settlements, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Bank of Thailand, the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China, and the Central Bank of United Arab Emirates. And I believe it started out between Hong Kong and Taiwan, but now Enbridge, towards the end of last year, they conducted a $20 million trial run between not just the Thai-Hong Kong corridor, but with some of their African partners in Belt and Road. And from August to September of last year, they issued $12 million in currency on the blockchain and settled $22 million in cross-border trade. Okay, that's peanuts, but it's proof of concept.
Sure.
And another multi-central bank digital currency experiment is Project Dunbar, which has some of the same players, Bank of International Settlements, and the central banks of Singapore, Malaysia, South Africa, and Australia.
Colombia's on the fence, but Lula in Brazil and a bunch of the South American countries are also uniting to copy something similar and get off and de-dollarize as well.
Yeah, you want to rap about the SUR a little bit? That's the currency that I believe Lula campaigned on.
Yeah.
The SUR. But before we get to that, you and I have talked about this and podcasted about this. Sergei Glaziev, minister in charge of integration and macroeconomics for the Eurasian Economic Council, he has discussed a new trading currency based on a basket of participating sovereign currencies and 20-some exchange traded commodities, which will undoubtedly include oil, which makes it interesting that a lot of these Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries are also in the Eurasian Economic Council, and they're all buying gold. And so with the BRICS poised to expand, they are also, it's not only the Eurasia Economic Council might have a currency, it's not only Enbridge, it's not only Project Dunbar, but the BRICS themselves are talking about a currency. And I've heard that it might be called 5R or R5, based on the first letter of all of the countries in BRICS now, because all of their sovereign currencies all begin with R. The Rial, the Ruble, the Rupee, the Renminbi, and the Rand. That's a snappy name.
Sure.
R5.
Yeah.
The new currency to say, fuck you to the dollar.
Yeah.
And the central banks of Russia and India are considering the establishment of a gold bank, central bank currency for their own bilateral foreign trade settlements, because, you know, Belt and Road is getting all the attention, not in American media, but by attentive, perceptive observers of the international monetary scene like you and I, Mark French.
Mm-hmm.
The international north-south corridor linking India, Indian Ocean, Persian Gulf, through Iran, through the Caspian Basin, to Russia, and to the Baltics, and they're going to fix Nord Stream at some point. I'm sure of that. But
that's actually an interesting and provocative thing. I'm curious to see. I think it's the Norwegians and the Finns that were likely green lighted and were totally okay with the Americans blowing it up because they also hold a lot of hydrocarbons in that part of the water. I'm curious to see if it's Norway or Finland or both that construct the pipelines needed to turn the German gas back on.
Well, Sweden, Denmark, and Germany have all conducted their own independent investigations of what happened
Yeah.
in Nord Stream, and they have not released the findings. And I believe Sweden said something to the effect that, yes, it was sabotage, but due to existing security arrangements with other countries, we will
Not
not
going to say
release
anything
it.
else about it, right? Yeah.
We won't release our findings.
Yeah.
I mean, if they had a shred of evidence that it was Russia, they would be shouting it from the rooftops.
I mean, the idea that Russia would blow up its own pipeline when all it had to do was shut a valve off is just completely ridiculous.
It's absolutely absurd. And yet that was the go-to remark that the punditocracy was bellowing in American media for the few days it lasted.
It's comical.
But Cy Hirsch's article indicted Norway, NATO member Norway, as a co-conspirator. His basic thesis was that it was a Navy mining team in Panama City, Florida, in conjunction with Norway boats and Norway divers that laid the C4 on Nord Stream under the cover of the NATO Balt-op military exercises last year, and that a NATO craft threw down some sonar buoys 3 months later after the military exercises that triggered the C4 to explode. And just a few days after that sabotage, Norway's own natural gas pipeline to Poland was made operational.
Wow, what a shocking surprise.
I'm as shocked as you are. I'm as shocked as the French cop in the movie Casablanca.
Yeah.
In Humphrey Bogart's casino.
Yeah.
Here's your payoff, Captain. I'm shocked to see there's gambling here. Thank you very much for the payment. So now NATO is making a fortune selling its natural gas to Poland, and
Sure.
and Poland is being a transshipper, I would imagine. And America is marking its prices up 400-500% of liquefied natural gas.
Yeah.
So it's not just that commercial motivation behind the destruction of Nord Stream, to my mind.
Sure.
The Hirsch article says that, well, we thought that Germany's support in the war against Ukraine would get shaky during the winter because they'd need the natural gas to heat their homes.
Sure.
And to say nothing that low-cost natural gas from Russia was at the heart of making Germany an industrial power, an industrial export powerhouse.
Yeah.
And the economic engine of Europe. So you can go back as far as geopolitical thinkers like Brzezinski, who said that the one grouping we don't want to ever happen is Germany, Russia, and China or Iran. Basically, Germany being a part of any Eurasian integration project.
Yeah.
So I think, and Cy Hirsch was pretty explicit. His informant was pretty explicit. It was really Biden, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who came up with this bright idea to blow up Nord Stream. And I don't think it was just for the commercial advantage that Norway and American gas producers enjoyed. I think it was to prevent this broader, more longer term Eurasian integration.
Sure.
Because
Yeah,
that threatens it.
I mean that goes all the way back to the work of, you know, Halford Mackinder in 1904, making it blatantly clear that the Eurasian landmass was one unified landmass. So I think the thing that frightens some people with Belt and Road taking hold and taking place in a very meaningful way is whoever does figure that out could potentially have a great power across the entire landmass.
Yeah, let's take that back as far as the Great Game between Tsarist Russia and Imperial England.
Sure.
And back then as well, Afghanistan was where these two expanding empires finally met.
Mm-hmm.
For England, it was the frontiers of India, and for Tsarist Russia, it was moving south from Central Asia. And that you're exactly right to bring up Mackinder in particular. And during the last couple podcasts I made, before I was delighted to be reunited with you, Mark French, I had to fly solo. And so then there were just rants and not discussions. But one of my rants was about the Nord Stream explosion and that's the collapse of the entire Atlanticist project.
Mm-hmm.
And NATO is just a piece of that. And it includes all of the other multilateral institutions that America has been dominant within.
Well, and then you bring up another good point there, bringing that up. As the ice begins to melt in a meaningful way up there, some of those shipping lanes that open up and some of the drilling that is going to begin to occur in places that have up to this point been unavailable, huge fights about who's going to control the waters and area up there for even more drilling and extraction and shipping lanes.
Yeah, I think we may start to see Arctic shipping and certainly additional Arctic drilling.
It's not far away.
And who's up there? U.S., Canada,
NATO,
Norway,
Russia.
Russia.
Yeah,
So
that's
basically
right.
NATO and Russia.
Yeah,
Greenland is Denmark, so it's basically NATO and Russia.
that's right.
But to dip back to Eurasia, because the Great Game was in the 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
and if we look at the international north-south transportation corridor from the Baltic Sea to the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean, that is what began as a collaboration between India, Iran, and Russia. It now has 11 members. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkey, formerly Ukraine, Syria, Belarus, Oman, and Bulgaria has observer status. So the Great Game has never gone away.
Right.
There is this new north-south corridor to complement the east-west corridors of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And it is going to make the geopolitical importance of Iran continue to expand because they're going to turn into not only a major petrochemical power, but a transport hub and transportation power. And I believe Mackinder's exact quote was, "He who controls Eurasia, the world island, controls the world."
That's right.
And as you stated, that was in 1905, and it hasn't changed. And I think that was, if I can credit the geopoliticians in American elite with any intelligence, very short-sighted, myopic pseudo-intelligence, but I think they were trying to keep Germany out of that type of broad-based, expansive Eurasian integration. But it's not going to work.
No.
And if we could dwell on Nord Stream in Germany for a second,
Yeah.
I believe one of the 4 pipelines is still operational. And when Biden made
Yeah,
that
Nord
comment
Nord Stream 1, right. I think it's 2 or 3 or 4 of the Nord Stream 1 lines are still fully operational. That's right.
Yeah, I think 1 out of the 4 still survived.
Oh, got it.
And I believe that's 1 out of 4 survived.
Mhm.
And and when Biden made his comments that have been played on some, the new media ecosystem, not on legacy media in the United States, certainly around the world. But Biden's comment, with the German head of state standing next to him, he said, if Ukraine if Russia invades Ukraine, tanks and troops going over the border again, then there will be no
Nord Stream 2. Yeah, that's right.
We will bring an end to it. And then a reporter asks, well, if it's under German Russian control, how will you do that? Oh, we will do it. We have our ways.
Yeah.
See, that was February 2022. And according to Seymour Hersh's article, planning for the bombing began in December of 2021.
Sure.
So that coterie of those 4 idiots
Yeah.
had already settled on a kinetic terrorist plan.
Yes.
And if there's one thing Cy Hirsch mentions in his interview, if there's one thing that covert people really dislike, it's blabbermouth politicians.
Mm-hmm.
So here's President Biden standing next to the German chancellor saying we're going to blow up one of your most essential pieces of international economic infrastructure
Engines, yeah.
to freeze your people and deindustrialize your country.
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, inflate your energy costs in the meantime to the tune of quintuple.
Yeah. And I believe the journalist who asked the question in English of Biden, well, how will you do it? We have our ways. Biden doesn't know where he is half the time.
Sure.
And a rapid onset dementia, the gait of someone that has Parkinson's, he's barely holding it together.
I cannot even imagine the amount of drugs going inside that guy's body to get him to Weekend at Bernie's, get in front of a camera and speak for 5 minutes at a time.
I don't know if it's Adderall or meth.
Yeah, both.
Both. A delightful cocktail.
It's got to be the liquid version of lightning.
Yeah, white lightning. Ooh, mighty appealing. How I'm feeling. Oh,
yeah.
White lightning.
Yeah, it's bad.
The reporter that mentioned that to Biden asked Chancellor in German, well, do you know about this? What's going on? And he said, well, everything we do together with America. So the question now is, did Schroeder know?
Right.
Is that his name? Schroeder might have been the guy many back, even before Merkel. But the guy now, the head of state of Germany now, he either knew or he's playing along like an absolute lackey while his country deindustrializes. And I think the German people, it will eventually get into their mainstream media. I believe they will withdraw from NATO, and that will dissolve NATO. So that will prove that the Nord Stream terrorist action.
Well, and so might the French. You just brought up a very good point. If Germany and France go, it goes.
Yeah, and France has always had a very independent streak,
Mhm.
and they had pulled out of NATO for some time while de Gaulle was leader. And I think if the German people wake up that Nord Stream was blown up by their supposed ally, then they're going to pull out. So these geniuses, the four horsemen of the apocalypse in American political leadership, what they thought was such a clever idea is probably going to destroy NATO. And if Germany leaves because they had their infrastructure blown up, and France leaves out of issues of national pride and national interest, which they've always had, then yeah, NATO and the EU and the euro itself are quite possibly even in jeopardy.
Sure.
I've heard that people, we saw that little chart about how people reverted back to the dollar during the Ukraine tumult, because what I've heard the dollar referred to as the winning the least ugly prize in the international beauty contest of currencies.
Yeah, for people in the know, if you will, that does come up over and over again of why that happened, which is not going to be the case much longer.
Yeah, because I think we're seeing these commodity-based Eurasian currencies coming to the fore.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting Credit Suisse analyst, Zoltan Pozsar, who says that these commodity-based Eurasian currencies might be a kind of Bretton Woods 3. And let's jump back to the SUR that Lula campaigned on, which is a uniting South American trade currency. Well, China's Belt and Road Initiative has rail corridors and energy corridors, and I would imagine telecommunication corridors on land throughout Eurasia. But they also have the maritime Silk Road, and that's going to Sri Lanka and East Asia, East Africa, and West Africa right now. And they've signed up a lot of countries in South America as well. So if we're looking at Eurasian currencies or BRICS currency or the SUR, I think one or all of these currencies could come into existence in the near to medium term.
Well, currently the only plan to put rail across the entirety of South America from one huge port in Brazil to one huge port in Chile, the only plan for that right now is from the Chinese.
Yes, and that region accounts for 5% of the world gross product, but it's heavy on food and commodities.
Right.
Which China has an absolutely omnivorous appetite for.
Well, and that reinforces and piggybacks on the point that you just brought up. Inputs are going to matter as we worry less and less about filling up Walmarts with planned obsolescent plastic crap that nobody really wants or needs. Real quality things are going to matter. Rare earths, metals, where's all this lithium coming from? What are we going to do to modernize electricity and communication? Food, grain, pigs, cows. So and it gets back to your gold point becoming so valuable in the ignoragnum while all of this stuff gets stitched together in a meaningful modern way.
Yeah, you brought up lithium. The lithium triangle, which is beneath Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, has
Patagonia.
58% of the world's lithium.
Yeah.
It's called the lithium triangle. And I don't know if you caught this one, but the commander of the Southern Command, who is a woman, I love intersexual warmongering and imperialism.
Yeah, it's supposed to soothe everyone and make us feel so much better.
Yeah, it's just wonderful that it's a woman who is head of South Command now. And while China's signing all these deals with Africa for mutually beneficial infrastructure, America set up AFRICOM. But if you listen to a recent speech by the head of the Southern Command, which is America's military branch over South America, she just listed all of the commodities that they have.
Yeah.
That they want.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never heard it so expressed so bald-facedly
Sure.
before.
Yeah.
It was just like a shopping list of everything that South America has, and
Yeah,
that's the
right.
justification.
Yeah, like a Theodore Roosevelt style coffee and bananas speech.
It was remarkable.